Wonderful. I see people still kind of joining. Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks so much for joining us. Um, I think I'm going to go ahead and just get going because we're about 4 minutes after. So on behalf of the Association for Latin American Art, I want to extend a warm welcome um, to fellow ALA members and fellow book enthusiasts as well. So my name is Joanna Reyes, and I'm the Vice President of ALA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event in our third annual summer book launch series. So these book launches are a celebration of the remarkable breadth of scholarship produced by our members. These offer space to reflect on years of rigorous, path-breaking work that continues to shape the field of Latin American art history. We have two more book series coming up, which I'll give you more information about at the end, and we would love to see you there. Today, we're thrilled to feature John López in conversation with Barbara Mundy and Ricardo Padrón, discussing López's recently released book, The Aquatic Metropolis, Urban Design and Environmental Change in Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. All members can purchase the book at a 30% discount. Let me see. So it sounds like, so there are two codes. One expires at the end of this month. So the NR26 code expires at the end of June, but beginning July 1st, 036NR is the code that you can use to purchase this book through Penn State Press. And we want to thank them for providing us that discount code because I know that we want to read this book. Just to do brief introductions. John López is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of California, Davis. He holds a Ph.D. in the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art program from MIT. López's work centers on a comparative and interdisciplinary approach to scrutinizing the visual, material, and spatial practices between Europe and Latin America during the early modern period. In addition to his monograph, The Aquatic Metropolis, López is the editor to Brill's companion to Viceregal Mexico City 1519 to 1821. His scholarship has appeared in Art and Ecology, Ethnohistory, Journal of Latin American Geography, and Grove Art Online, among other venues. López's research has been supported by the NEH, SSRC, ACLS, SAH, Fulbright-García Robles, the University of Chicago, and the University of California Hellman Society. Welcome, John. I'd like to introduce Barbara Mundy as well, who will be in conversation. Barbara is an art historian best known for her work on the history of cartography, urban history, and the history of the book. Her work focuses primarily on Mexico and New Spain and the interactions between indigenous peoples, settler colonialists, and their environments across the colonial period, roughly 1520 to 1800. With her first book, The Mapping of New Spain, The Maps of the Relaciones Geográficas, she brought to light the largely overlooked colonial mapping traditions of the native peoples of Mexico. Her recent prize-winning book, The Death of Aztec Tenochtitlan, The Life of Mexico City, chronicles the great urban metropolis of Mexico City to reveal the indigenous foundation that lies beneath one of the largest cities in the world, past and present. Mundy holds the Robertson Chair in Latin American Art History at Tulane University. And finally, Ricardo Padrón is professor of Spanish at the University of Virginia, where he studies and teaches the literature and culture of the early modern Hispanic world. His research on space and empire in the maps and writing of the period has produced two monographs, The Spacer's Word and The Indies of the Setting Sun, both from the University of Chicago Press. He served on the governing board of the Renaissance Society of America and is the founding president of the Society for Early Trans-Pacific Studies. Thank you again for being with us, and we're really looking forward to a thought-provoking conversation today.
Let me share my screen. So first, let me thank Joanna Reyes for the lovely introduction and for moderating today's session. I also want to express my gratitude to Leslie Wolf and the members of the ALA Executive Committee for their generosity in providing a platform to present, portion or ideas of the book today. And especially much thank yous to Barbara and Ricardo for their insightful comments in reviewing the book, which helped me to crystallize its argument, and for joining me today in presenting, uh, discussing the book today. I also like to thank Ellie Goodman, who is the executive director at Penn State University Press, and her wonderful staff for marshaling the Aquatic Metropolis to publication, and to Jesus Escobar, the editor of Penn State's Building Landscape and Society series, for giving the book an intellectual home. So, as you can tell, that there's many thanks that I owe, and I don't think I can ever repay the debt, the intellectual debt that people have, the generosity of people who have supported this work over a number of years. Um, the Aquatic Metropolis examines three large points: the relationship between the Aztec and Spanish water management practices and the urban designs of Tenochtitlan and Mexico City, respectively. It also scrutinizes the urban development of Renaissance Mexico City by eliminating Tenochtitlan's most iconic feature, which is water. And it also demonstrates the urban and ecological consequences of the desagüe in the age of climate change, which is the method by which the Spanish eliminated Tenochtitlan's water from the base of Mexico City. Not, not, no one discipline can adequately answer all of these questions. And so the book is actually an interdisciplinary approach to these research questions that combine art history, architectural history, the histories of science and technology, and cartography. The through line that helps us to think through these different disciplines is the environmental humanities, which is, I think, an important approach that art history is just starting to think about in its as a research agenda. And so what I'm going to do today is not take you through the whole book chapter by chapter, but share with you a set of images that help us to understand the larger stakes of the book and the historical context by which the Spanish and the Aztec produce very radical different cities via competing urban and environmental ethics. So I want to start here, which is probably an image that is very familiar to the ALAA community, which is the frontispiece to the Codex Mendoza. The book treats the upper register of the Codex Mendoza as an image of the cultural landscape of the Aztec. It proposes that the Aztec are not just defined by, or Tenochtitlan is defined by a lake, but that the Aztec are socially and politically organized by the four quadrants and the canals that organize the island schematically into quadripartite schema. What this image is thus is an idealized image of Tenochtitlan proper, but it is also a communicentric image. And the wonderful work that Barbara has done with the maps of Relaciones Geográficas tells us that native map makers, that at the core of a native map maker agenda in Mesoamerica is the depiction of the community itself, that the world outside of the community and the boundaries are of no interest in a description of the essence of who they are as a people who are tied to a geographic area. And so Barbara's work, which was incredibly helpful in reading through this cultural landscape of the Aztec, tells us that Tenochtitlan, that the Tlacuilo who produced this image of Tenochtitlan used that same mapping impulse here, where the island is bounded or by water, and that there is no interest outside of the terrain of Tenochtitlan from a topographic standpoint. What this tells us in terms of the map the map of the frontispiece is another important factor, is that water is the essence by which Tenochtitlan is defined, but also how the Aztec historicized themselves at the time of the founding of Tenochtitlan. Now, what in thinking about the cultural landscape, then it offers us an image of Tenochtitlan proper, an image of how the Aztec socially and politically organize themselves by using water, but also of the natural landscape itself. One of the things that the frontispiece and the rest of the folios of the Codex Mendoza failed to do is to provide a longer history of the Aztec prior to their founding of Tenochtitlan in 1325. And so to understand then that the Codex Mendoza is just an intermediary chapter of a longer Aztec history. And so to understand the origins of the Aztec, we have to turn to the La Tira de Peregrinación and its first folio, here where we have the Aztec departing Aztlan. What these images now tell us is that the Aztec conceptualized historically and in myth that they were island peoples. And so what these two images tell us is that Aztlan and Tenochtitlan are in an ecological mimesis in how they mirror themselves, with the essential message being this, that water surrounds land. It also tells us that this ecological relationship is based on an aquatic similitude between these two islands, one in history and one in myth. The architectural development of Tenochtitlan is not based on some architectural precedent in Aztlan, but rather is framed along in geographical terms. And so Aztlan and Tenochtitlan are connected across time via migration, but united in geography by water. The Aztec, when they conceptualize how to construct Tenochtitlan proper or schematically, they look to the cosmos. And here we have the frontispiece of the Codex Fejevari-Meyer. And one of the important aspects of this frontispiece, it's the structure and order and cyclical nature of the cosmos. The fact that the Aztec modeled their city after the structure, order, and cyclical nature of the cosmos tells us a lot about how the Aztec conceptualized their city as being the imago mundi of the world. And so what we are starting to see here is a series of images that are telling us a great deal about how the Aztec conceptualized water historically, myth, and metaphysically in the construction of Tenochtitlan. And so in this image in particular, we also see the St. Andrew's cross and the Four-Me cross as a way of structuring Tenochtitlan in this image. Now, all of these uh, historical, metaphysical, mythical ideas around water don't construct a city itself. They give the city a cultural resonance. And so what the Aztec must do to construct their own city, which now we have the Nuremberg, an image of the Nuremberg map and of Tenochtitlan, is that they must translate these ideas into brick and mortar to build a city made from water. And so what we see here is the Aztec idea of their their use of hydraulic technology to shape the natural world to their cultural precepts. And one way that they do this in this portrait of Chimalpopoca, um, is by building hydraulic structures that will give the city its cruciform plan, which we see in the Nuremberg map, which is the iconic structural form of the city. Now, Chimamalpoca um, wanted to build an aqueduct because to bring fresh water from Chapultepec, because the Aztec would drink the water from the lake, and which was termed as agua muy sucia y turbia. Now, the Aztec at this time constructed a very modest aqueduct that was soon washed out by the 1429 flood, which tells us that Aztec hydraulic technology was a learned practice. It wasn't something that was uh, had reached its full canonical form at this moment. The other thing that is important about this aqueduct that was constructed from Chapultepec, which we can see here in the upper, well, not the Chimalpopoca aqueduct, but a different one that was constructed later, is that the Aztec viewed this in terms of the judgment of water. By claiming that the water was muy turbia and sucia, they were making an assessment as to the quality of water, which then they associated to the architecture of their predecessors as being inferior to them at this moment in time in 1428-29 when this aqueduct was constructed. And so we're now starting to see how the Aztec are starting to make this value judgment around water and its correlation to architecture. The other method that is, or the other phenomena that is incredibly important to the Aztec is militarism. The Aztec, the development of Tenochtitlan cannot happen without the Aztec being the preeminent military power in the region. In these two images here, the one on the right tells us of how the Aztec exacted tribute from Xochimilco, Coyoacan, and Azcapotzalco to build the southern branch of the southern causeway of Tenochtitlan. What the Nuremberg map omits for pictorial quality is that the Aztec or the Tenochtitlans shared the lake with another island city, Tlatelolco, who were also Aztec and who had splintered from Tenochtitlan in 1427, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head. What the Aztec now are looking to do via their militarism is to conquer the other lake communities and other communities of the basin as a way of obtaining tribute to build out build out the causeways. And the way that they do this, particularly with Tlatelolco, which we see here in Achacayal's military victories, another folio from the Mendoza Codex, is that in 1477 they defeat they defeat Tlatelolco. By doing this, they bring the northern branch of the hydraulic network, which was under the supervision of Tlatelolco, under the purview of the Aztec, who controlled the southern branch of that hydraulic network that we saw in the Nuremberg map. And so what this does two things. One, it seeks to orient this whole hydraulic network under Aztec supremacy. And two, it seeks to wrest history, pre-Hispanic history, from Tlatelolco by usurping the network that is under their control into an Aztec or a Tenochtitlan-centric narrative that states or argues for the supremacy and preeminence of of Tenochtitlan and the Aztec. Now, water was incredibly important to Tenochtitlan. It was viewed as a geographic element or an element of nature that gave Tenochtitlan its beauty. And in 1499, Ahuizotl recognized this beauty under the idea of frescura y hermosura. In other words, water gave Tenochtitlan freshness and by extension gave it its beauty. Now, Tenochtitlan suffered from a series of floods, but also droughts. And Ahuizotl knew that the next drought would disfigure Tenochtitlan's beauty. And so what he wanted to do via the construction of the aqueduct, which we have here an image of, uh, where the Aztec are uh, uh, providing gifts to Chalchihuatl for the goddess of lakes and streams, is for the production of this aqueduct. Now, the Aztecs are now giving metaphysical cover to their hydraulic practices in these gifts to their water deity. What happens historically is after the aqueduct gets constructed, it's believed that Tenochtitlan would have in perpetuity frescura y hermosura. But 40 days after it's constructed, the aqueduct floods Tenochtitlan and disfigures the city, strips it of its beauty. And so now we have to think about these hydraulic works in a couple of ways. That they translate these metaphysical ideas of water deities into hydraulic practices, but that these hydraulic practices are learned. They're wrapped in lofty proclamations and in disastrous results. So there's an undeniable truth about Aztec hydraulic technology. It was never perfect. It's a history of failures. What these images tell us is that these images are these are documents of the Aztec environmental ethic and of the Aztec architectural canon. These two systems or epistemes are manufactured or molded to the cultural precepts of the Aztec worldview and produce and help to produce an Aztec urban ecology. This relationship is never perfect between the architectural canon and the environmental ethics. But the fact that the Aztec are looking to synthesize them speaks volumes about who the Aztec are too. These images tell us that water is generative for the Aztec. It is the source of their social and political identity. It helps to historicize them both in history and mythology. It is the basis of their metaphysical understanding of the cosmos. And so water is, for the Aztec, is the natural element par excellence in the pre-Hispanic world at this moment. And so water is to the Aztec, as what Carolyn Dean has demonstrated, stone is to the Inca. Now, no empire can last forever. And so the Aztec and Tenochtitlan are defeated by Cortez and his multi-ethnic army in 1521. And the introduction of a new ruling power introduces a new set of understandings about the character of architecture and urban design and environmental ethics and their relationship. Of course, the Aztec provided the Spanish a model by which to follow to live in an island city, but that model held none of the historical relevance or the social capital that the Spanish desired for Viceregal Mexico City. The Spanish, as part of their recollection of European antiquity uh, in their uh, in the early modern period, as part of their Renaissance quests to become classical, introduce into Tenochtitlan a series of classical architectural principles that derive from Vitruvius and his treatise on architecture, De Architectura. And so, what the Uppsala map captures is a is the drastic urban transformation that Tenochtitlan has undergone in just 30 years. And what we have here, one of these principles is the rigidness of its orthogonality. Parallel streets intersect other parallel streets at 90-degree angles. Type, not geography, is the impetus of this urban development. And what this Renaissance urban plan does is introduces a new historical origin for Mexico City that is not tied to any of the historical or mythological materials of the Aztec. And so it produces a tension between the city and the natural world that is going to increase the propensity of flooding in the colonial period. And after a number of floods starting around the early 1550s, the Spanish wanted to drain the lakes. And it's a project, the desagüe, that is does not get implemented until 1607. And these two images are by Enrico Martinez, who is institutes of the desagüe, and the other image is by Andrés de San Miguel, who is a proponent of the desagüe. And these two images are based on Ptolemy's geography and Euclid's elements, which tells us the importance of humanism in the desiccation of the lakes to save Renaissance Mexico City from New World nature and any environmental crisis that it poses. And so what Martinez proposes is to dig an indigenous hand-dug tunnel to breach the northern mountains of the basin of Mexico to drain the lakes into the Gulf of Mexico, which is some 400 miles away. Now, San Miguel and Martinez were not friends. Actually, San Miguel held Martinez in contempt and called him the most barbaric man in the world because San Miguel's criticism stems from the idea that Martinez allowed nature, not reason, to dictate the construction of the Desagüe Tunnel in 1607 and 1608. Instead, San Miguel proposes to use Euclidean geometry to transform Martinez's tunnel into a monumental or open trench and to construct a monumental canal from Lake Mexico to the open trench. Now, to give you just an understanding of how monumental this canal is, at the shore of Lake Mexico, the canal had to be 9.2 meters deep, so nearly 30 feet. And it would increase in depth as it went along the basin of Mexico to meet the Tajo Abierto by originally the tunnel and then the Tajo Abierto by Santa Cruz. And so what we now hear, now we're now starting to see is how science and mathematics, ideas from classical Europe are now being, and theories from classical Europe about how to map the world and how to use Euclidean geometry are now being used to solve a new world problem. That is, how to eradicate the water that surrounds Tenochtitlan to save Mexico City from flooding. Now, not all the Europeans wanted to uh, drain the lakes. And these images are images that help us understand the proposal by Adrian Bott, who is a Dutch hydraulic engineer who came to Mexico City to assist Martinez with the desagüe. And once he arrived in Mexico City, he basically said that the desagüe is worthless. Do not drain the lakes because it will increase the city's propensity to flood. Now, Bott proposed to rebuild the Aztec hydraulic network, which meant that Mexico City had to remain an island. But he also proposed to introduce Dutch hydraulic machines, as we see here in these images, to help regulate the lakes, which would give Mexico City a Dutch appearance. Now, the the proposals by Bott in 1614 and 1520 were rejected by colonial authorities. They were a dead end of culture, of history, and of because they offered the Spanish none of the humanistic approaches to urban design and water management that they expected and saw in the proposals by Martinez and San Miguel and Andres de San Miguel. And so it left the colonial authorities no choice but to push through with the desagüe. Now, Venice is probably the only covial example that we can relate to with the construction of Tenochtitlan. And one of the things that would be very difficult for us to believe today is that anyone would actually want to drain the lagoon in which Venice exists, because there is an ecological and architectural relationship between the city and its lagoon. However, with no moral or historical obligation for the Spanish to continue the Aztec aquatic mandate, they did just that. They drained the lakes. And this produced a series of issues, ecological and urban issues, that are now plaguing the city. From Diego Garcia Conde's image, we now see that land surrounds Mexico City, not the lakes. And from Israel Valen's subsidence uh, proposal for a pavilion for the Alameda, we now know that Mexico City since 1900 has subsided more than 10 meters. Hindsight tells us that Adrian Boot was correct in his assessment that the city would inundate and subside even more if the desagüe came to fruition. What he didn't know, in what Andrés de Saldivar had proposed, is that the desagüe would reclaim land and that it would allow for urban expansion into these former lake beds, which is exactly what happened. What San Miguel did not know is that the urban population of Mexico City would construct wells to tap into the aquifers that are below Mexico City to quench the thirst of one of the largest populations in the world, which has triggered subsidence to a greater extent. In the next 150 years, Mexico City is predicted to subside another 30 meters. A climate prediction suggests that the temperature of this region will increase by 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. Both projections are can Mexico City can ill afford both projections for the following reasons. Subsidence will allow water to naturally collect at the basin of Mexico where Mexico City sits, and an increase in temperature climate creates a phenomena of holding 7%, where air will hold 7% more moisture, which means that this region will have a greater rainfall. And what it will do is it will flood Mexico City even more. So to give you just some hard facts, since 1980 to 2000, Mexico City flooded 668 times. By comparison, Tenochtitlan flooded every 64 years. Colonial Mexico City flooded every 14 years on average. Climate change will increase drastically the city's propensity to flood. And so, what the Aquatic Metropolis does is, at the end of the book with the coda, is that it identifies that the consequences of climate change are not a recent vagary of nature, but rather have deep historical roots in the colonial past with the Spanish idea of severing Mexico City from Tenochtitlan's aquatic ontology by draining the lakes to save their Renaissance urban center from New World nature. And so that Mexico City is now one of the largest cities in the world, is one of the most drastic urban and ecological transformations in the history of humankind. And so I want to leave you with with the, it's with a short clip.
On July 31st, 2000. On July 31st, 2025, southern Mexico City, especially the borough of Tlalpan, was slammed by one of the most extreme rainstorms in decades, dumping more than 38 million cubic meters of water in just hours. That single day's rainfall far exceeded the typical July average of 298 millimeters, nearly doubling historic levels and overwhelming the city's drainage systems.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Wow, that video was really demonstrative of the issues that you're discussing. Um, okay, I'd like to invite Barbara and Ricardo to join now, and I'll just pass it off to you guys.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
Barbara, do you mind if I blab a bit? Because I know
You
you'll
go
have more interesting
first.
things to say than I will. John, first of all, I want to congratulate you. I'm going to say here in front of everyone, I, like everyone else, has done my share of peer reviewing. Rarely have I read a manuscript with such enthusiasm and joy. I really think that this is an important book, a wonderful book. I encourage everyone here to buy it, to read it, to assign it to your students, to give it to your friends. Uh, I really think, and I was very excited to know that Barbara was the second reader and that she was going to be here with us today. because I really think in many ways your book picks up where Barbara's book, The Life of Mexico City and the Death of Tenochtitlan, I think I have it backwards, leaves off. You know, for a long time, when we asked the question, when does Tenochtitlan become Mexico City? We thought we knew the answer. And the answer was with the conquest of the Aztec capital, the old city was destroyed and a new one was built on top of it. And Barbara upended that story by showing us the many ways in which the indigenous city lived on. Um, and so you give us another answer to that question. When does Tenochtitlan become Mexico City? And I think both of you have taught us that it's a mistake to pinpoint any one moment. But you really lead us to think that it's the question of water management. And water management sounds like such a dry engineering way to put it, because this book is actually about urban ontologies, you know, and I was so glad to hear you use the word aquatic ontology towards the end of your presentation. Very, very different ideas about what a city is and specifically what the relationship of a city can be or should be with water. And so it's with this decision to drain the lakes that we really see the indigenous city becoming the Mexican city in sort of profound and interesting ways. And of course, this is all happening well after the conquest. I'm going to say this one thing, and then I'm going to leave it to Barbara. One of the most compelling things about the argument, I think, is everything you have to say about Adrian Boot, you know, because when we talk about drivers of historical change, and get into these old questions about, what drives history? Is it culture? Is it material things, economic factors, so forth and so on? The point in the argument where I really see culture, that is, ideas about what a city can and should be driving this change, is when you present us with this image of the road not traveled, of the option foregone. Um, Everything I know about Adrian Boot's plan for saving Mexico City from flooding, I read from your book, but my understanding is that this is a perfectly feasible plan, one that worked. And in your remarks here about the coda, you say something about how Adrian Boot was right in his analysis of the nefarious and unexpected consequences of the desagüe. So to think that during the 17th century, the powers that be in Mexico City forwent, they rejected a workable example, something that would update the Aztec system of water management and make it work for reasons that seem primarily ideological, cultural, intellectual. That is, I think, one of the moments in the text where we really see how ideas about the city are driving so much of what is going on here. So it's not only a wonderful book about Mexico City, but also a wonderful example of a moment of historical change where cultural and ideological factors are really playing an important role. And that's one of the many things I so enjoyed about your book. So once more, I'll congratulate it and I'll hand it over to our friend Barbara.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ricardo, for those illuminating remarks. I want to reiterate my congratulations to you, John. This was really, I know, a work of love for this. And in some ways, it is a kind of love letter to the incredible city of Mexico City, where you spent a lot of time and have family connections. And I really want also to underscore the new ways that you embrace environmental history. And I think it's so important what you've done in terms of helping art historians think through how their own work can connect to current concerns about climate change, and how artworks are very important pieces of evidence for understanding environmental histories. I also was really so struck at the beautiful ways that you connect, that you lay out a kind of European episteme of what a city should be, and you bring it into Tenochtitlan, and then you really follow through because your book doesn't end in the 16th century. You really push it through and think about the ways that water and these debates about water have shaped the city. So it's a wonderful achievement about the longue durée of water management. And I want to echo Ricardo in saying how wonderfully it's written. It's so lucid and so accessible. And it's really one of those books when you read it, you think, oh, I cannot wait to share this with other people, because this is a portrait of the city that will resonate to not just specialists, but to students, people interested in environmental history. So it's really great, a wonderful achievement and beautifully illustrated. So so congratulations. I actually wanted to ask you a question, because one of the things I think you do so beautifully is you argue that visual representations, rather than just being kind of reflective or pieces of evidence of historical events, actually are drivers of change, that they have a particular kind of agency. And as art historians, I found that such a compelling reading of these images. So could you address like the ways you get at that particular agency of the wonderful images that you reproduce in your book?
So, first of all, I think, let me just say this, that the book answers an architectural history question that's rooted in a department of architecture, which is, I'm an architectural historian. And so art historians, like what art historian is going to work on like flooding and sewage, like in this way in urban design, right? But art history and its methods, or art history is the method by which to answer this architectural history question of these two competing ideologies. And so one of the things that I think that we do in art history is that we give images agency, and we search for that agency of not just the image, but of the artist. And what is that agency trying to convey through the production of images? And so, as we all know, images don't depict reality in a symmetrical way. They interpret reality, and they're also the basis by which the imagination comes alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the imagination plays a big role in my reading of these images as to how are these historical figures, both indigenous and non-and European, how are they approaching image making as an epistemic tool to think through these larger environmental questions? And how are they imagining the world? And so these figures, right, these Western and non-Western historical figures, they have the imagination, both the Aztec and the Spanish and both, the imagination to imagine the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, the imagination plays a big role in how I'm reading these documents of hydraulic technology.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or these documents that have nothing to do with hydraulic technology, but we can read the essence of water in them, which is the visual culture of water, which is what this book kind of frames all of these images under this one rubric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
John, if I could follow up on that question, what you're saying is really akin to a favorite book of mine. I don't know if you know it, The Rhinoceros and the Megatherium by Juan Pimentel, which is about the relationship between art, especially drawings, and scientific innovation. Uh, Whenever, I see these pictures of the plans for the desagüe, like the ones that you showed, I'm always astonished by the scale of this thing, you know?
Mhm.
And I think you impressed some of the audience members when you were describing to us the trench that they want to build. Someone commented about the amount of manual labor
Mhm.
that that would be required to build the trench. Yes, so I see David here in the chat is dying to pop in slow violence in a sacrifice zone.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, you know, uh, I'm wondering about images because I think you're very right that images allow us to project, to imagine, to transform our world. Yet the images that we were seeing made no mention of the work involved and who was going to do
Mhm.
it, you know? And there's this dark side to the image in that respect that they invisibilize the labor required. The labor required seems like, well, a problem to be fixed down the road. So I'm just kind of thinking aloud about this
Mhm.
and was wondering about your reaction, thinking about the politics of the imaginative power of images.
Right. I think you're very right, Ricardo, in the sense that these images mask the what is a horrible lived experience for the conscripted native peoples who were forced to labor in the construction of this Agua tunnel and the canal. Um, it is part of that settler colonialism. And if I can uh, champion Barbara's book, but also Vera Andy's book as the book where you should read these three books together to understand that kind of epistemic violence that urban reform and landscape reform demands in the production or construction of Renaissance Mexico City. And so I think Vera Candiani does a, an excellent analysis of that kind of disenfranchisement that happens to Native communities as they're being conscripted for hundreds of years in this work. And also, slaves were used in the construction of the Sagwe Tunnel. So there is a multi-ethnic uh, coalition of laborers who are there for a couple of reasons, not just their labor, but for their technical expertise too, that is being grafted onto this colonial project.
Yeah, and I also want to jump in on something that you mentioned kind of at the end of your remarks. But one of the things that's happening with the Desagüe is you have these vast land reclamation projects, and there is profit to be made in land
Mm-hmm.
in a way that there's not profit except to be made in water.
Right.
And Sergio Miranda has a new book coming out about kind of the larger process of the Desagüe. And it's very clear by the 19th century, people are, land prospectors are eager to dry up Xochimilco because they will be able to sell the land. And I wonder how, the impact, again, to connect it back to art history, whether our art history's comfort with representing land and its multiple modes for land representation um, is also part of that process of privileging the appearance of land rather than water, which is almost impossible to represent. We think about maps, it turns into a big blue surface. So
Mm-hmm.
is art history and its modes of representation also implicated in this privileging of land over water?
So, two responses to your questions, Barbara. One is Andrés de San Miguel, when he proposed his own desagüe project, argued for its immediate success and stated that the causeways which were used for flood control could be dismantled immediately, and that the reclaimed land that drainage would produce would be of such great value that it would pay for the desagüe itself and that it would eliminate Mexico City's greatest defect, its environmental setting. So even in the historical moment of the desagüe, this whole conception of land is very important. Now, this comes from this hierarchical notion or relationship between the city and the countryside in its very kind of European sense of how the countryside or the hinterland supports the city itself and how it is can be an economic agent. Uh, the other point, I think, is much more methodological and historical for art history. You know, the one beautiful thing about art history is that it has a long historical uh, existence. The downfall of art history is that it has a long historical existence. The discipline is rich in its canonical approach to the study of the noble arts, but it has failed miserably in thinking through broader sets of issues that fall outside of its traditional scope of investigation. This is why my PhD program in 1975 started, because it started out of from art historians breaking free from Harvard and from other the elite institutions on the East Coast to create a program that looked at these questions outside of the traditional art historical canon. Visual studies has done this too. And so one of the things, and I'm not, and by arguing and by identifying its limitations, I'm not stating that art history has no value. I think art history has tremendous value. I think what we need to do is think about the role of art history to answer larger social, environmental, and political questions, because it gives us a wonderful canon and a series of methods by which to interrogate objects, regardless of if they're the noble arts or not, to tell the stories that have been left out of the traditional art historical canon.
Joanna, is it time to open it up to people? I see people kind of
Yes.
chomping at the bit
Mm-hmm.
in the chat.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just jumping back in. Thank you guys so much. This has been so interesting. So yes, absolutely. Please, if anyone has a question, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask. This is not a webinar. This is an open space for dialogue. Um, yeah, there were some interesting points in the chat. I'm sure people have been keeping up with it as we've been going, but maybe I'll just get us started if that people are feeling a little shy. So we'll just I had two thoughts. I mean many thoughts, but two specific thoughts, John, thinking about this. One of them, you know, I'm interested in this notion of the sort of environmental humanities. And I was thinking about this book that I had read, gosh, back in grad school called The Reformation of the Landscape. And this is looking at
Mm-hmm.
how Reformation Protestantism and Catholicism, you know, affected the landscape in the UK. But so thinking about that, so, you know, thinking about these sort of like iterations and thinking about, you know,
Mm-hmm.
landscape, I was thinking about the idea of place and indigenous knowledge systems. And I'm wondering if you
Mm-hmm.
see a future in which this sort of environmental humanities and an incorporation of indigenous knowledges, might that be a future direction um, in this area? Sorry, this is also related to a project I'm working on right now, so this may be a little self-serving.
As I'm sorry, so let me ask a question, clarification. As a research as a research avenue, or
Yeah,
not
I'm just thinking
exactly.
about the direction of environmental humanities. So many of historic, historic images that are, kind of dating to the early post-colonial period, but, thinking about incorporating indigenous knowledge systems into that framework. Is that a direction you could see being fruitful, or, what do you think is the sort of future of this framework of environmental humanities, and what can it like bring to us as art historians?
So I think it's already happening. I think it's been happening for some time now with the work on water, ritual, water, Maya. I forget her name off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but when I was writing my dissertation, I felt like I was on no man's land with the environmental humanities and
Mm.
this book project. But what I'm seeing now is this big turn by a lot of art historians to the environmental humanities, and they're approaching it in so many different ways. And so I only see what I see is a
Mhm.
very bright future for the role of the environmental humanities in art history. And while it's still in its kind of infancy of developing its methods, I think that there are wonderful models with literary studies and eco-criticism by which to learn from and to apply to the study of images. And
Mhm.
there's a small group of art historians across, the kind of the history of the world. I'm thinking about Shigata Ray at Berkeley, who's also a wonderful eco-critic,
Mhm.
thinking about the role of the environment in art history. And so I see a bright future.
Excellent. Okay. Um, there was an interesting comment by Ray Hernandez Duran up the chat a little bit, but thinking about variations of landscape representation and W.J.T. Mitchell's comment in Landscape and
Mhm.
Power about landscape being not a
Mhm.
noun but a verb.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, thinking about not what landscape image depicts, but what it does. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or want to uh, expand on some of the images that you've been discussing with us today.
Um, so there's trying to remember his name, um, but the whole conception of altepet, right? Alt, water, tepet, mountain. In the language itself, there is already an etymology of these words that create a semantic link between language, society, and the natural world. Altepet, Landschaft, these other terms that are used in to describe this kind of socio-ecological relationship between societies in the land are very important because even even Europeans, right? We have a way of demonizing Europeans for what they've done to the Americas, and rightly so, right? These European historical actors. But at one point, even Europe had and it still does in many instances, a wonderful understanding of how people shape the land and the land shapes the people. And it's a reciprocal relationship. And one of the things that is important is that rupture that we associate with European arrival and this kind of mathematical scientific method of understanding the land is a cultural choice. And it's one that was institutionalized, but it's also one that we can uninstitutionalize by making other cultural choices as to how we think about our relationship to the land or to water or to natural elements. And so it takes another epistemological shift to reinstitutionalize a new way, a new kind of ecological thinking, which is what Mexico City will require if it's going to survive in the age of climate change.
Thank you. Okay, so I did post a comment. If anyone wants to ask a question in the chat, if you're, not wanting to go on camera. Oh, we have one hand up, Chase.
Can you see me and hear me? Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. Oh, sorry, I'll lower my hand. I'm Chase. I'm a PhD candidate in history at UCLA. And I've not yet read this book, so my question is premised on that caveat, but I'm so excited to read it. I was very curious about this Dutch figure because this moment in the early modern Netherlands is full about these legal debates about water ownership, not only of the ocean, so famously, of course, Hugo Grotius, but Grotius is also writing about more temporary types of water, so things like canals or water that dries up in the summer, or so who owns this water? And I was really curious if you noticed any specifically Dutch intellectual influences in this figure's thinking about water and the landscape. And this is slightly different, but also the Low Countries as the center of the prints that are arriving to Mexico. But again, I very much enjoyed this conversation, so thank you.
So intellectual, can you repeat that part? Intellectual.
Yeah, I was curious if you noticed any specifically Dutch intellectual influences on thinking about water and water ownership in the way he's trying to reconstruct Mexico City in that 17th century moment.
So Dutch hydraulic technology has a longer history than the desagüe. It starts really in the early medieval period of Europe, and it slowly develops over time. One of the things that is really interesting about how Dutch hydraulic technology, or the practice of Dutch hydraulic technology, is that the hydraulic engineers who engineered canals and dams and dikes actually were not only paid for the services, but were allowed to keep a percentage of the profits made by their hydraulic works. What happens in Mexico is that, so let me go back to the Low Countries and the Dutch example. They also had water boards that would administer these hydraulic works. And these water boards were city-based. And so there was a lot of local knowledge being applied over time. So it was learned knowledge. And this was a practice between these civic entities and private equity or private money. And so there was private enterprise that was also helping to funnel the construction of these hydraulic works. The difference in Mexico is that this is not a private endeavor. It is a municipal endeavor that is sanctioned by the Spanish crown. And by extension, the citizens of Mexico are taxed. So they have no financial interest in the desagüe themselves. Actually, many times they rejected the desagüe as a flood control method because it costs so much money and it never really worked. The other way that is different is the indigenous labor that is being conscripted. And even though they're being paid, they have very little rights in terms of their own labor. And so these rights become also very different as to how these laborers are being conceptualized or understood for the labor that they're producing in or giving in the production of these hydraulic works. I'm not saying that it was more equitable in the Low Countries, but the system itself worked very differently. So it was very hierarchical, top down. The other way that I think is going back to Bott's work is that it was rejected because it didn't offer any of the humanistic sensibilities that the colonial authorities expected. And also, it was during the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 80 Years' War. So he was looked at with great suspicion. And Martinez even called him an imposter because he lacked the kind of scientific and mathematical aptitude, according to Martinez, to come up with a theoretical project. Instead, he comes up with a very hydraulic project that is very practical, in which Martinez criticized by saying, even the quote unquote, even the Indians did that kind of stuff. And so there was a value judgment made on about Booth's work. By association, he was guilty because his hydraulic proposal on one level resembled very much that of the Aztec. On the other, the introduction of hydraulic machines is something relatively new to the area.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. Thanks.
To follow that up, John, I'm also this raises the big question of, is this attempt to prioritize sort of European modes of land management as opposed to Dutch ones also part of this long colonialist process of demonizing or devaluing both indigenous technologies for land management, but also very practically like indigenous control of the valley? Because if it's underwater, indigenous people know what to do with it. But if it's only when it's kind of when it has a surface that it becomes measurable, alienable within this kind of Spanish framework. So I'm wondering if you're also in underlying Boot's story is also a story about indigenous dispossession.
That's right, because by association, Boot was guilty of lacking a technologically superior approach to water management. And while Martinez and the colonial authorities claim Boot's work to be poco útil, of little use, they couch that within indigenous hydraulic water management practices. And so the criticism of Boot is also a criticism of these indigenous hydraulic practices and knowledge and understanding of the relationship between land and water that has been mediated for centuries. And so they immediately disavow Boots wanting to rebuild the Aztec hydraulic network because it meant a couple of things. One, that Mexico City would remain an island. Two, that the Spanish had no way of understand or refuse to understand or appreciate the Aztec method for water management. And three, that the Aztec monuments of hydraulic technology, causeways, which were massive, miles long, 20 to 30 meters wide, these are architectural landmarks. And so the architectural landmarks of the Aztec that tell of the Aztec history and of the Aztec aquatic consciousness would also frame Mexico City's urban landscape. And what the Spanish are wanting to do is not to accept Aztec technical knowledge or hydraulic works, because their worldview in their quest for their modernity in the Renaissance is to remake Tenochtitlan a classical city in form and in spirit. And so the Dutch approach, the Aztec approach, are not going to be acceptable for them because it's a cultural dead end and also a dead end of architecture.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Allison Kaplan.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. This was so exciting to learn about. I am so excited to teach with this book. Um, so one of the things I really appreciated as you were going through this project was your longue durée approach. And I think we really do see the value of understanding this project from moving really through a lot of different periods of time. And I'm thinking too about sort of exciting methodological things that are happening as you are moving through these different periods. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of like the prehistory and the post-history to the timeline that you gave us. So I was wondering if you were able to get a sense from the sources that exist of the way that Mexica water management practices related to or differed from those of the people who were already living on Lake Texcoco when the Mexica arrived. I don't know if that's an answerable question or not, but I would love to hear sort of what the parameters are about what we can know about that. And then I also wanted to ask you about sort of like the chapter after where you ended, if you have a sense of what water management techniques might look like going forward into this, series of really sort of scary environmental changes that you laid out for us. Thanks.
Yeah. So as we know, the Mexica, the Aztec were the Johnny-come-latelys of the basin. They constructed their history and their whole mythology around water ex post facto. This is not something that happens, or this is something that happens quite often with historical figures in historical communities, is how do you mythologize your past? And so one of the things that we know is that the Aztec had to learn hydraulic technology from other lake communities. That this wasn't an inherent or a a a basis of knowledge that they were acutely or fundamentally aware of and practice in. And so so they had to learn this, and they learn these, the first, the Chimamalpocas Aqueduct was a series of mat reeds staked to the lake floor, and then with rocks placed on top of them to sink those mats down, and slowly it would build up, and then was lined by split, hollowed out logs. Now, this is not something they invented. This technology is being borrowed from the other lakeside communities that are around the area, particularly like this Xochimilco and then the Chalco region. So they usurp, and this is why I want to make sure I try to make sure in the book, even though I try to identify the great kind of stakes of the Aztec in water, I want to make sure that I also identify that the Aztec hydraulic technology is a series of failures, and that this is not perfect. These are not, to use Creech's term, these are not ecological Indians. Right? And so as they rise to power, not only are they learning technology from other lakeside communities, they are usurping those hydraulic structures for themselves, as they did with Tlatelolco and the northern branch of the cruciform causeways. Now, the post history, I don't post-apocalyptic history of Mexico City. This is a wicked question, a wicked problem. We know that Mexico City in between 1634 and 35 and 1629 to 34 was flooded. This is a 5-year period of flooding. Present day Mexico City can't afford to be flooded for 5 years. Unlike the United States, where the United States has a series of cities that are the nexus of industry and capitalism, New York, Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, and of education, Mexico City lacks that kind of geographic diversity. You have Mexico City, you have Monterrey. Whether Mexico City can survive as one of the largest cities in the world is a question that I don't know can be answered now. But I think the Aztec and Adrian Bot and the Venetians can teach us a lot about how to think through this Mexico City's current problem. And so currently, Mexico City uses drainage as its primary method of water management. It's a 400-year-old method. The tunnels are vastly superior, technologically speaking, than Martinez's tunnel ever was. But it's still the same method, with the principal message being that Mexico City must be waterless. Now, architects around Mexico City are trying to reintroduce water into the city. That is important to create these ecological spaces. And so now we're thinking about containment and regulation of water, which is what we can learn from the Aztec. I'm not saying that we need to rebuild Tenochtitlan, because that ship has sailed a long time ago, and that's a romantic viewpoint. But we can extrapolate from what the Aztec, the Mexica, and other lake communities have done and continue to do to create a water management plan that thinks about the value of water and thinks about the relationship of water to land. Now, the one problem that we have with Mexico City is that the subsoils below Mexico City, they've been compressed so much now and dehydrated of its water. This is why subsidence takes place, because of the evacuation of groundwater, that they've gone beyond their point of elasticity. You can't rehydrate them anymore. Put a dry piece of Play-Doh in water and see if you can get it to be moldy again. It's very difficult. It becomes very brittle and it'll break. This is the same kind of phenomenon with a very simple explanation on my part. And so we have to stop Mexico City subsidence, because climate change is going to bring more rainfall. And more rainfall means a greater propensity of flooding. We have to capture this water and regulate this water in a way that's more efficiently used in not just the kind of urban development of the city, it's kind of urban ecology, but its social practices. Because water is a natural resource that allows us to understand how power and privilege disenfranchise people who live on the perimeter of the city and who are usually the first ones to flood. And unlike Mexico City of the 16th, 17th century that just flooded with rainwater, these people now flood with the sewage of one of the largest cities in the world, because these drainage tunnels double as a sewer system too.
Thank
Wow.
you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Allison. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been wonderful. I want to thank our panelists, so John, Barbara, and Ricardo. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight, and for your thoughtful contributions to our book launch today. We're so grateful for the discussion and for everyone who helped make this event possible. As a reminder, if you're new here, this webinar was organized by the Association for Latin American Art, a community dedicated to advancing the study and appreciation of Latin American and Latinx visual culture. If you're not already a member, we'd like to invite you to visit our website We have tiered membership rates, and please follow us on social media to learn more about our work and how you can get involved. Before we go, I want to make a quick plug. So this is the first of 3 summer book launch series that we will be doing. So please mark your calendar. We'll be meeting again on July 31st to discuss a book by Gabriela Aceves Sepúlveda, and on August 28th for a book by Florencia San Martin. So once again, thank you everyone for being here. Follow us on Instagram to stay up to date on our events. And I hope to see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.